Okay, today we'll be talking about uh, the 1930s and Japan's war with China. Um, we know that historically, China has been this big brother to Japan in East Asia, right? During Tang Dynasty, during the 7th and 8th century, China gave Japan a lot of cultural, political influences, right? Um, when it comes to the modern time, Japan never gave up the ambition to occupy a part of the continent, or at least the Korean Peninsula. So during the 1590s, Hideyoshi invaded Korea, but he was stopped by Chinese and Korean allied force. And then in the 1890s, um, precisely 200 years later, the Japanese returned to Korea and tried to take the peninsula again. And this time it succeeded, thanks to all the modernization and the industrialization Japan has achieved during the Meiji Reform. Okay, at the same time, China is also changing rapidly. Uh, as we mentioned before, China was forced by European powers to enter the modern era. The traditional Chinese empire has been there for 2,000 years, although there has been some internal developments, but basic structure remained the same, right? You have this emperor at the top. You have a huge bureaucracy, which is something that Japan lacked in pre-modern time. China's Chinese style of bureaucracy is something Japan never had. Okay, the Japanese, no matter the shogun or the emperor's court, are pretty simple. Pretty simple. They did not. Japan never had a huge or elaborate um, bureaucracy like China had, and that the Chinese bureaucracy is based on um, the system called a civil service examination. Through this system, the Chinese empire could recruit talented commoners, just anyone, basically anyone. If you take the civil service examination and you pass it, then you get an office in the government. Okay, so this made sure the the empire only recruit the most talented man from the society. Anyone can take that civil service examination, and the curriculum is Confucian classics. You study Confucian classics, and then you take that exam. If you pass that, you get an office in the government, and with a handsome salary and honor from the emperor. So it's a system that worked pretty well for the last 1,000 years in China. But this system did not work that well. It did not work that well when European powers invaded China or bullied China. Okay, so China first lost the Opium War with the British in 1840, between 1840 and 1842, and then China was further defeated by the French in Vietnam. It was called Annam back then. So China lost that, just like China lost Korea to Japan. China lost uh, Annam or Vietnam to French. So the French turned the three countries in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, into French colony. This is in early 20th century. This place is called French Hindochina. It's a French colony. Okay, the French lost this colony to the Japanese during World War II. Okay, so this is the complicated history in Asia. Okay, and then in 1894, China first lost the war with Japan. We call this the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 to 1895. This is different from the so-called Second Sino-Japanese War, which started in 1937. The Second Sino-Japanese War is actually part of the World War II. It's part of World War II, okay? Because that war lasted all the way to 1945, when Japan finally surrendered unconditionally, okay? Um, Okay, back to late 19th century, China lost the first Sino-Japanese War, and then as a result, China lost Korea to Japan and lost Taiwan to Japan. China almost lost Manchuria, this big chunk of northeast Chinese territory. It's called Manchuria. China almost lost Manchuria to Japan, but only because of European powers' help, especially Russia. A Russian intervention, Japan cannot take Manchuria just yet in 1895. But Japan returned and defeated Russia in 1903, 04. This is called the Russo-Japanese War, and then after that, Japan controlled the southern Manchuria. Uh, and then eventually Japan occupied the whole Manchuria in 1931. We're going to talk about this. So Japan's occupation of China is step by step. It's step by step. Every like 10 or 20 years, Japan would encroach on some Chinese territories, took some city, took some provinces, and gradually took this a big giant, right? Because Japan is too small, right? This is just the situation is almost like a snake trying to swallow an elephant. It has to do it step by step. Okay, so first the Sino-Japanese War, China lost the war and lost Taiwan to Japan, right? And Japan could have a stationing army in Manchuria, mixed with the Chinese army. So this set up the origin, the roots for the crisis in the future. Okay, um, and also China paid a lot of money to Japan as war indemnity. And Japan used that money to build up a national public school system and also boost its own economy. Um, so after China lost the war, some Chinese realized that they probably need to learn from Japan. Okay, so now previously in history, it's always Japan learning from China, but now after China is defeated by Japan, uh, the Chinese realized that it's necessary to learn from Japan. So in 1898, um, China sort of had its own political reform. China tried to transform itself into a constitutional monarchy, sort of a Japanese style, but it failed. The situation in China is kind of complicated because the last empire in China was established by an ethnic minority called the Manchus. They're from Manchuria. This is why Manchuria is called Manchuria, because it's the land for the Manchus. The Manchus were ruling China for the between the 17th century to early 20th century. Okay, the Manchus were ethnic minorities. They don't want to have democracy. The Manchus don't want to share rule with the Han Chinese, which are the majority of the Chinese. So this is the reason why the 1898 political reform failed, because the Manchu imperial court did not want to have a constitutional monarchy, because when you have a constitution, that means the Manchus, the ethnic minorities, are losing privileges, they're losing political power. So it failed. And then in 1900, there was a rebellion in China called the Boxer Rebellion. A whole bunch of peasants, they're practicing martial arts, um, and the Chinese boxer peasants, they're killing foreigners, including Japanese. So this rebellion ended with a crackdown by foreign powers. 11, 11 foreign powers declared war with China. Well, China first declared war against 11 foreign powers, and then the foreign powers invaded Beijing, including Japan. Japanese were actually Japan's sent a lot of troops to Beijing. So after the Boxer Rebellion, Japan supported some Chinese revolutionaries to overturn the Manchu Empire. Eventually, in 1911, there was revolutions breaking out everywhere in China, and the Manchu Empire was overturned. So Japan got what they wanted. But after that, the new government was not successfully established. China split into warlords rule, different warlords ruling different provinces. There was no central government in China. So that's the situation in China after 1911. Okay, to the left you see this guy called Dr. Sun Yat-sen. He's a Chinese revolutionary that um, aimed to overturn the Manchu Empire. And he got a lot of support from his Japanese friends. A lot of the Japanese associations and politicians, they all privately or openly supported Sun Yat-sen's revolution. Most of the Japanese did not want to see the Manchu Empire to continue to rule China. They want to see China to follow Japan's path and create its own constitution, if not a constitutional monarchy, but at least something more modern, a modern political system. Okay, so that's Sun Yat-sen. And then to the right, the photo on the right shows shows another Chinese. His name is Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was a Chinese president during World War II. He was leading China to fight against Japan. But when he was young, during the when he was young, he was sent to Japan to study military. A lot of Chinese went to Japan to study medicine, study law, to study Western subjects and military. Chiang Kai-shek studied military in one of the most famous Japanese army academy. Yeah, it's Japanese Army Academy. He didn't do very well. We actually saw his report cards from the from the Japanese military academy. He didn't do very well. He got a lot of C's and D's, but it doesn't matter. He got trained in military, and then later he returned back to China, and he eventually he became the president of China, and he led China during World War II fight against Japan. Despite his experience of learning, studying in Japan, he never surrendered in Japan in World War II. This is something very interesting. Okay, so China is being carved up and bullied by all these foreign powers, including Japan, right? So China is like a pizza. It's being carved up by all these European powers, right? British, French, Tsarist Russia, America, and Japan. And Chinese couldn't stop it. So this is the situation in Japan. I'm sorry, in China. So Japanese always wanted to control part of China. So when China is suffering from warlord rules and a warlord civil war, in the 1920s and early 30s, there was a lot of civil war in China. Different warlords are fighting against each other. Uh, Japan quite often would pick up a warlord and they say, "Hey, we will support you, okay, but you have to represent our interest." Okay, this is a basic strategy that Japan tried to control China. Um, and on the other hand, remember Japan had a stationing army in China's Manchuria after the Boxer War in 1900. So in 1931, some local Japanese military commander they decided that they're gonna attack Chinese, and they're gonna occupy the entire Manchuria. This military operation was not approved, pre-approved by Tokyo. So their bosses, the Japanese headquarters in Tokyo, they have no idea what the local military officers are doing. Okay, but in 1931, September 8th, the local Japanese um, military force launched an attack on Chinese. But this this is surprising attack worked out. So oftentimes Japan learned from this success later. This is why they often try to launch military attack, without officially declaring war. Right. This also happened in Pearl Harbor, but years before Pearl Harbor, Japan already did this and they succeeded. So this military operation succeeded within 2 months. They kicked the Chinese troops out of Manchuria, and Japan controlled a new territory here, 6 times larger than Japan. 1931. Okay, um, Japan did not set up a colonial government in Manchuria because this is not allowed uh, by international law. Okay, so Japan wanted to have a legitimate government in Manchuria controlled by itself. Okay, so for that reason, Japan um, find the last emperor of China. Remember, the last emperor of China was overturned, right? He was dethroned by revolutionaries in 1911 when the empire collapsed. So after that, the last emperor of China, his name is Pu Yi. He's a Manchu. He's a Manchu people, but he's assimilated in the Chinese. He speaks Chinese with a Beijing accent. Okay, so Pu Yi was kicked out from his imperial palace in Beijing in 1931, 32, when Japan controlled Manchuria. Pu Yi, although he was a Manchu, he never went to Manchuria, his ancestor land. He never went there. Okay, he lived in another city. But Japanese found him. Okay, Japanese found him, and the Japanese say, "Hey, you're the last emperor of China. You were overturned by Han Chinese. Don't you feel, aren't you mad at the Chinese revolutionaries, right, who kicked you out from the palace? But here, we Japanese will help you to become emperor again. This time, you can come to Manchuria. Manchuria is your ancestor land, right? And then you can become emperor of the Manchuria state that we Japanese help you to build." So Puyi agreed to the Japanese help. So he went to Manchuria in 1932. He became emperor again in his life. In this case, he became the emperor of the Manchuria state. Manchuria state, okay? Or Japanese call it the Manchu Koku. Koku means a state, right? So Manchu Koku means a Manchuria state. The so-called Manchuria state was established in 1932 with the Japanese help. But this state is totally a puppet state of Japanese. The Japanese local military commander, the Japanese local military, the Japanese army in Manchuria is called the Kwantung Army. The Kwantung Army, okay. The Japanese Kwantung Army's commander is basically boss, is the boss for this Manchuria state. Okay, so in other words, Puyi, the Chinese and Manchu emperor, is just a puppet. It's the figurehead. So this is Manchuria, 6 times larger than Japan. So when Manchuria state is established, more than 1 million Japanese immigrants they traveled from Japan to Manchuria to colonize this fertile land. This is a very, very fertile area because when the Chinese Manchu Empire was ruling China, no Han Chinese was allowed to farm this land because this land is the ancestor land for the Manchus who are the ruling class. So the ruling class in China under the Manchu Empire did not allow ordinary farmers to work on this land. So the land is super fertile, a lot of natural resources. Now, 1 million Japanese immigrants uh, migrated to Manchuria in 1932. They found a new home, they found a new farm, they got the best land, they kicked out the Chinese, and then they were building this new state, this new Manchurian state until 1945. Unfortunately, in 1945, um, well, fortunately for the Chinese, unfortunately for the Japanese, in 1945, when Japan was in last stage of World War II, in August, 2 or 3 days after Americans dropped atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the Soviet Red Army launched an attack on Manchuria, and within several days, they crushed the Japanese Kwantung Army in this area. So so after that, in 1945, um, Manchuria was given back to China. Okay, so more than 1 million Japanese immigrants had to leave the land, according to the agreements by the Allies. So the towards the end of World War II, all the land that Japan has taken from China had to be returned back to China, including Manchuria, Taiwan, Qingdao, right? And Korea has to become independent. So so this is the origin for Korean War, right? We know that in between 1945 to 1950, although Japanese were kicked out from from Korean Peninsula, but the peace was not there. 5 years after World War II, a hot war broke out during the Cold War era. That is the Korean War. We can talk about that later. But Japan benefited from Korean War a lot. Okay, so this is we're back to early 20th century, back to early 20th century. Okay, so China learned a lot from Japan. A lot of Chinese students went to Japan, including Chiang Kai-shek, and a lot of Japanese new vocabularies, new kanji, was imported into China reversing. So remember, the kanji was something Japanese learned from China, right? But in late 19th century and early 20th century, Japan invented a lot of new kanji vocabularies to refer to Western terms like a society, like a history, right? All these new terms are 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 Western terms, and the Japanese invented new kanjis, Chinese character vocabularies to denote or refer to those terms. And now the Chinese are learning the new kanjis from Japanese. Okay, um, so that's the situation. Okay, 1931. In 1931, Japan took China as a Manchuria. Um, this military operation, remember, was not pre-approved by Tokyo first. So when the Japanese Kwantung Army took Manchuria, some Japanese politicians they say this is not allowed. This is not acceptable. We should return Manchuria back to China. Okay. Actually, the Japanese prime minister made that argument, but most Japanese especially the military did not want to do that. They want to keep this land. Okay, they consider this as a huge military success. Eventually, the emperor made a decision. They say, okay, let's let it go. What happened has already happened. Okay, so the the Japanese headquarters post approved this military operation, um, initiated by local military officers in Manchuria. This gave Japanese military officers a message. The message is that you could do anything you want, but if you succeed, then it will be later approved. You'll be okay. Okay, if you succeed, that's okay. But if you fail, you're gonna have to take some loss. Okay, so this adds up to something we call military adventurism. Okay, so the local military officers they would often do things like assassination, like attack foreign countries without approval from their boss. They would often do this. This is quite a tradition within the Japanese military. They would disobey their bosses, their superiors' order. If they succeed in their initiatives, they will be okay. And sometimes they will be rewarded, like in Manchuria. They would local military officers just they decided to take it by their own, and there's no punishment. There is no punishment. Uh, well, the Chinese certainly suffered a huge loss, right? So the Chinese sent they resort to the League of Nations. Remember the League of Nations? That's the international organization established after World War One, right? So the Chinese resorted to the League of Nations. The Chinese complained. They say the Japanese violated international law. They took this huge chunk of Chinese land, and they should have returned Manchuria back to China. So the League of Nations they launched an investigation. The League of Nations hired an American guy to launch an investigation, and the mission sent a report back to the League of Nations saying Japan is at fault. Okay, Japan is the invader. They violated international law, and then the League of Nations requested Japan to withdraw their army from Manchuria, but Japan rejected this request. And furthermore, Japan simply they quit the League of Nations. They quit the League of Nations. Japan thought um, the League of Nations is bullying Japan. So it's a pretty complicated issue, right? So Japan, as a result, just keep in mind, Japan quit the League of Nations. So Japan doesn't want to, you know, be with other European powers anymore. Okay. All right. So Korea. Let's talk a little bit about Korea. Just like what happened in Taiwan, Japan had this colonial rule in Korea. It tried to assimilate Korean population into Japanese nation. Okay, but Koreans know that they're not Yamato nation. Okay, they don't speak Japanese. They don't worship the Japanese emperor. Although Japan had this colonial education in Japan, I'm sorry, in Korea. For example, all Korean kids they must only study and learn Japanese at school. Okay, for a Korean kid, you may speak Korean at home in your family. That's fine in your private life, but in all public occasions, in school, for official education, the official language is Japanese. And every morning you have to salute to the Japanese national flag. You have to sing Japanese anthem. You have to celebrate when the Japanese emperor is having birthday, right? So you basically are considered as a subject of the Japanese Empire. So that we call this colonial education in Korea. This colonial rule is pretty successful in Taiwan actually. After 50 years of colonial rule, right, from 1895 when Taiwan was given to Japan to 1945 when Japan surrendered and had to give Taiwan back to China. That's precisely 50 years. 50 years of colonial rule in Taiwan made a lot of Taiwanese thought, I think they're Japanese. Okay, but this did not happen in Korea. Okay, the Koreans they never forget about their history or their national identity. There's a lot of resistance movements against Japanese rule. In order to rule the Korean, the Japanese built a modern style. If you look at this photo is an overlook of the Korean capital, Seoul. Okay, Seoul City. Here is this traditional palace used to be the Korean king's palace. Okay, it has been there for hundreds of years. Okay, um, but when Japan occupied Korea, the Japanese built right in front of the king's palace. They built a Japanese governor's office building. Okay, the Japanese governor's office building is right in front of the old king's palace. Okay, so in this case, architecture served as a propaganda method. The Japanese are trying to send a message to all Koreans. The message is that we, Japan, we represent modern civilization. Okay, so when we rule you, it's not a colonial rule. It's not a colonialism. It's a modernization. Okay, we're here to help you modernize your country to make your life better. That's the message they try to say to the Koreans. Okay, so this is why they built this modern style Japanese governor's office building right in front of the king's palace. This is gonna be the center, the new political center of New Korea. So that's the idea. Uh, but remember, Korea used to be a kingdom, right? If you look at this picture, this is to the left. You have this the last king of Korea, the Chosun dynasty in Korea. Okay, and standing behind him is the throne prince. So according to tradition, Korea is a kingdom. Okay, is a kingdom. But when Japan controlled Korea, uh, of course they cannot allow the traditional royal family, Chosun royal family, to rule Korea. So um, the old royal family of Chosun Korea was stopped. So the king was eventually was dethroned, and he died very quickly, and the throne prince just disappeared. We have no idea where he went. He probably assassinated by Japanese. And to your right is the Mingxiang queen. She is the last queen of the Korean Chosun dynasty. Okay, she actually wanted to reform Korea, to turn Korea into a modern country, but she never accomplished this ambition until she was killed by Japanese. And after she was killed, her body was chopped out into pieces and thrown into fire. So it was a lot of atrocities that the Japanese did in Korea. So if you look at the Korean history, it's pretty poignant, right? It's more than 100 years of a humiliation, right? Humiliated either by Chinese or then by Japanese, and then by Russians, right? And then by Americans, so, and then suffered a lot of war. So Korea is really it has a very, very poignant, sad history in modern time. We're going to talk about that later. But Koreans never gave up on fighting. Okay, they always want independence. They don't want to be ruled by Japanese. Okay, for example, in 1909, when the Japanese Prime Minister Hirobumi, when Japanese Prime Minister visited visited the continent, he was assassinated by a Korean assassin called An Jong-gun. An Jong-gun. So An Jong-gun was later considered as a Korean national hero. Okay, and during the whole first half of the 20th century, when Korea was under Japanese rule, the Koreans they never gave up fighting. They had a government in exile under the leadership of someone called Kim Koo. Okay, this is Kim Koo. Yeah, this is his name in kanji. Yeah, Kim Koo. Kim Koo was leading a resistance and a exile government in Shanghai, in China's Shanghai. And then after World War II broke out, the Koreans moved their government in exile to Chongqing, another Chinese city. They kept on fighting until 1945. So Kim Koo was considered as the father of Korean independence. This is a postal stamp with his portrait on it. Unfortunately, Kim Koo died before Korea was liberated by the Allies. So he never was part of the rebuilding project of Korea. We know that peace did not come to Korea even after World War II ended. So this is a very sad history for Koreans. Okay, back to Japan. Japan is still on the path towards militarism. Democracy was declining. We're going to talk about all the reason why democracy was declining. 1929 depression, the Great Depression certainly was part of it. But on the other hand, all kinds of radical ideologies like fascism, ultranationalism also played a role in Japan's militarization. Okay, when Taisho Emperor died in the 1920s, his son Hirohito became the new emperor, and he picked up the new reign title that is Showa. Showa. Okay, Showa in kanji simply means uh, illuminant or brilliant and harmony. So these kanjis always have a meaning in them. Okay. And by the way, a lot of Americans wanted to tattoo kanji or Japanese style Chinese characters onto their body, but sometimes they put really stupid words on their body on the tattoo. So next time, if you want to put a tattoo on you, if you want to put a Japanese characters onto your body, send an email to Professor Wei. I will look at it to make sure that it has some good meaning. All right, so this is our Emperor Showa. Emperor Showa. Okay, two photos, one in a European military uniform, the other in traditional robe. Okay, so 1931, under the Showa rule, the Japanese Kwantung Army took China's Manchuria. We call this Manchuria incident in 1931. Okay, this marked the beginning of more and more Japanese military adventurism. Okay, Japan is going to provoke militarily many of his neighbors until they built a huge empire. Until they built a huge empire. Okay, the military is discontent with the civil government, with the parliament, and the constitution. Okay, the military wanted to change all this. First, they wanna get rid of the people in the civil government that they don't like. Second, they wanted the parliament to pass any budget law or budget bills to their favor. Okay, and the last, they want to change the constitution. They don't want a constitutional monarchy. They want to be ruled by the emperor personally without a constitution. Okay, they want to basically have a almost like a fascist, a totalitarian government without a constitution, without all these uh, 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 laws that provide checks and balances. They just want to be ruled by the emperor. But we know that the emperor cannot take care of all these military affairs. So that would give the military a lot of freedom to to attack any country they want, basically. Yeah. Uh, but in the 1930s, the military continued to have a budget conflict with the parliament. The parliament is still often try to stop. They refuse to pass a lot of a military budget uh, in favor of the military, right? So the military cannot get what they wanted. Uh, so in 1932, there's a naval mutiny. Okay, there was a naval mutiny. They killed the military, assassinated the minister of finance because they thought the minister of finance is in their way. Okay, and then in 1932 May, they also assassinated the prime minister of Japan, Inukai. Inukai is an old man. Okay, let's look at the local, look at the newspaper about this event. Okay, this is Inukai, Prime Minister Inukai. In 1932, one day he was in his office as the Prime Minister. All of a sudden, there are a whole bunch of young men. They're all affiliated with the military. Um, a bunch of young men stormed into his office. Okay, and then the Prime Minister said, "Young man, calm down, sit down, let's talk." But the young man uh, did not give him a chance to talk. They sent a bullet into his head and killed him. And killed him. Okay. So 1932, Prime Minister Inukai was killed in Tokyo. Uh, to the left, you can see Inukai's photo. To the right, this is a. I did not put the photo there by mistake. Okay, I put there on purpose. On the right, you have Charlie Chaplin, the American movie star, a movie actor. Why would I put a picture here? Because in 1932, when the radical Japanese militarists, when they assassinated their prime minister, um, on that day, Charlie Chaplin was in Tokyo. He was in Tokyo. He was visiting Japan, trying to facilitate some kind of a cultural communication, right? But he did not know that he was also on the assassination list. These radical Japanese young men, they want to assassinate, they want to kill Charlie Chaplin as well. But they failed only because they couldn't find him. Okay. Well, why would the radical Japanese militarists want to kill this American movie star? Well, the reason is simple. The reason is because they consider American culture as morally depraved, morally corrupt. Okay, those movies made by Charlie Chaplin, they represent humanitarian humanitarianism. They represent individualism. To a certain degree, they represent the importance. It focuses on the importance of private lives. Okay, but this is against Charlie Chaplin's movies are totally against the kind of a collectivism that the Japanese radical militarists promote. Okay, they want a totalitarian society, so they want to get rid of all these cultural contamination from the West. Okay, so after Inukai was killed, um, of course those assassins were all arrested. So the government is faced with the problem of how you gonna deal with these radical militarists, right? Um, when the trial is going on, the court, the judicial system in Japan, they received hundreds of thousands of letters and petitions from all over the Japanese nation, from all over the nation. And all these petitions are requesting the court to acquit these assassins. You know, a lot of Japanese people believe these young men, they did this because Inukai is not a good minister. Okay, uh, the, the public opinion in Japan is that these young men are patriots. They're patriots. They love the country so much that they, to the degree that they did something violent and reckless. But they had a good heart. They had a good intention. It's all about good intention. It's all about saving our nation from bad guys like Inukai. Okay, and some people even cut off their fingers and then mailed it to the judge, saying, "Hey, look at this finger. This represents my resolution. Sentence me to prison and release those young men." A lot of the court received a lot of letters like that, a lot of petitions like that. So eventually, the court only gave a very mild punishment to those assassins. So this further encouraged the military to have more and more reckless and violent operations. Okay, 1936, 1936, February 26, even larger scale mutiny came. This is called the February 26 incident in 1936. What happened is that in Tokyo, some local military, lower ranking military officer, especially this guy, the first lieutenant Yoshitada New, uh, Yoshitada New, he launched a mutiny. He led more than 2,000 troops in Tokyo, and they launched a rebellion. They launched a rebellion. They call this the second Meiji Restoration. Again, they thought the emperor is surrounded by bad guys. Who are the bad guys? The civil officials, ministers, prime ministers, and other civil officials that military men don't like. So so on February 26th, they launched this mutiny, and they stormed the prime minister's office. But luckily, the prime minister learned a lesson, right? I mean, there are one prime minister was already killed, so further prime minister they learned lesson. The current prime minister of Japan in 1936, he barely escaped the assassination by hiding behind the door. Yeah, he literally hiding behind the door so that the mutineers did not find him. But the mutineers, the rebels, killed other civil officials. Killed other officials. Okay. So yeah, the prime minister Keisuke Okada just barely escaped assassination. Um, but the emperor, I mean, this mutiny, this February 26th mutiny is at a much larger scale because it involves thousands of soldiers. The emperor heard about this news and he did not support. Emperor Showa did not support this mutiny. So he supported the decision to mobilize other military divisions from nearby Tokyo to crack down this mutiny. So eventually, this mutiny was cracked down. Um, so Yoshitada knew, realized after 2 days of a mutiny, Yoshitada knew realized that he failed. So he his last request to the emperor is that he said, "Emperor, I love you so much. I did this only because only out of good intention. So now I failed. Please allow me to commit seppuku." Okay, but Emperor Showa said, "No seppuku allowed. If you want to kill yourself, go ahead." So Yoshitada New just killed himself, and that's not considered as a seppuku. So his spirit tablet with his name carved on it would not be enshrined in the national shrine The Japanese has a national shrine to honor those who have died for the emperor. This is called the Yasukuni. Yasukuni is this Shintoist shrine in Tokyo. It's still there. Okay, so everyone who have died for the emperor or the empire, their names will be honored there. You will find their spirit tablets. Everyone, including those who have died in the war with the Bakufu in Meiji Restoration, including those who have died, who have killed in action in Korea in the First Sino-Japanese War, in Russo-Japanese War, or in World War II. Okay, a lot of the war criminals in World War II, right? We know that after World War II, a lot of Japanese military commanders and generals, they were sentenced to death by the Tokyo Tribunal. Tokyo Tribunal is this allies court to punish those Japanese warlords who launched the war. For example, those military generals who got involved in the attack on Pearl Harbor, if you're involved in the attack on the Philippines, right? In Philippines, we know that the Japanese killed a lot of um, American POWs, right? In 1942. So those military generals, those Japanese generals, are sentenced to death as war criminals. But after they die, their names are still honored in Yasukuni in Tokyo. So this is considered as the greatest honor for Japanese military servicemen. But people like Yoshitada knew if he committed seppuku, committed suicide without approval from the emperor, no, his name is not honored in Yasukuni. He's considered as a traitor. Is considered as a traitor. So this time, in February 26, 1920, 1936, this mutiny did not succeed. Did not succeed. Although they killed some ministers. Okay, but although this mutiny itself did not succeed, but it really scared away almost all the civil officials because all the other civil ministers, they know that if they still stand in the way uh, to the military, there'll be more and more assassinations. There'll be more and more mutinies. Okay, and not all of them are gonna be um, disapproved by the emperor. So the emperor could have approved some of those, right? So the civil ministers eventually they gave up. They gave up. They lost the guts to say no to military. So eventually, Japan is becoming even more and more militarized, even more and more like a fascist society. Okay, so oranges of the Pacific. I'll talk about this. How Japan is moving further and further on the path towards uh, another Great War. 1929, Great Depression. It created a worldwide economic crisis. We mentioned this a little bit, right? But now we're going to talk about this again. Um, okay, so the origin of the Great Depression basically is a dysfunctioning of the market for all capitalist societies. Most of the time, the market works. Okay, the demand and supply, they would match out, right? But sometimes when the economy could get overheated. Okay, it could get overheated, like in the 1920s. Okay, when the economy gets overheated, there'll be too much investment. There'll be too much investment. People are building too much factories, building too much restaurants, shops, right? Too much manufacturing capacities are created, but there is less demand, much less demand. So the imbalance will reach a point where you have a crisis. Okay, this is what we call economic crisis when there's too much supply, too little demand. This is the origin for 1929 Great Depression. So when this happened, a lot of investments will fail. And then the shops, since there is no demand, will have to be shut down. And then when factories are shut down, shops are shut down, there will be a lot of unemployment. A lot of people will lose their job. Terrible, terrible situation. Okay. Japan is also struck by the Great Depression. Okay, a lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of factories have to shut down. To solve that problem, the Japanese government is printing a lot of money. Okay, they first they set off a Japanese yen off the gold standard in 1931. Previously, the Japanese yen is linked to gold. So that means if you're holding a Japanese yen, you could go to a bank and exchange that bill with the real gold. You could do that. We call this gold standard. But in 1931, Japanese government announced that no, yen is disconnected from gold standard. So that means that this allows the Japanese government to print as much currency as they want to solve the problem of the economic depression. It did not really solve that actually, but this creates a huge inflation, Okay, we're talking about an inflation over like 15% every year. So the grocery prices are going up by like more than 15%, 20% every year. So that this means for ordinary Japanese workers, when they receive the same amount of salary from their boss, the same amount of salary can actually purchase much less. So that means actually their salary is reduced. Actual salary is reduced. So this is how some ordinary people lose a lot of money. Uh, Unemployment rate went all the way up to over 20%. Over 20% of people in Japanese society couldn't find a job. So this creates a lot of a crisis in the society. There was a lot of anti-capitalism, anti-capitalist rallies and protests everywhere. Uh, Industrial workers, when they lost their job, they're not happy. They're launching all kinds of protests. They're totally anti-capitalism. Socialist sentiments are spreading everywhere in Japan. People are talking about maybe we should form a new government like a Soviet Union to solve this uh, economic crisis, right? But the government is launching anti-communist laws. Okay, the government is putting all the communists into prison, but that doesn't really solve the problem. And then in the early 1930s, as we mentioned before, there are waves of assassination of civil officials by the radical militarists. So there's a lot of chaos in the society. Eventually, the parliament stopped functioning. Okay, the lower house basically are marginalized. They stopped playing an important role in the national politics. Okay, and there's uh, Japan has become more and more fascist in the sense that they have a central government that take away people's freedom, the freedom of speech, freedom of criticism, freedom of religious beliefs. All these were taken. Uh, you have a more and more strict censorship on people. The government is trying to become more and more authoritarian or even totalitarian. They put a iron-fisted policies on the society. Everyone who dare to criticize the government is in prison. Is in prison. And on the other hand, the Japanese governments and intellectuals they are criticizing modernity. They don't like modernity. Some people just don't like being modern. Okay, and they blame the West, the white imperialism, they blame European and American racism against Japan. They believe that all these are the roots for Japan's suffering. Why we're suffering all this inflation, depression, right? This chaos. That's because the answer from the government is that because of white imperialism. It's all because our enemies overseas that are against us. Okay, so as a result, Japan is totally militarized. Military budget went up to 70% of the national budget. You don't see this in modern society. No other modern societies have this high military budget. So most of the money uh, they they have, the Japanese put it into building more battleships and tanks and airplanes. So that's what they do. Okay, and the fascist ideology, fascist ideas are spreading. there is one guy called Ishiwara Kanji. Okay, this is him, Ishiwara Kanji. He's a middle-ranking military officer serving in the army. Uh, Ishiwara Kanji, he is one of the commanders in the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, and he authored many books saying we must have a final war with the world, one final war. And through that final war, we're gonna gain more living space, like in Manchuria. Okay, so we succeeded in Manchuria. That's a great thing, but we want more. We want the continent of China. Okay, and we also want the Pacific Ocean. We also want the Southeast Asia, and eventually we also want India. We want Australia. We want more and more. Okay, so this is a he's a representative of the fascist voice that wanna have more wars to expand Japan. Okay. Interestingly, this guy did not send. He was when war really broke out after in 1937, and then in 1941. In 1937, Japan first had a total war, had an all-out war with China, and in 1941, Japan had an all-out war with America. But throughout all these wars, Ishiwara Kanji was never sent to the front. He survived. He, although millions of Japanese troops died in the war, he survived. The one who advertised the war the most before the war actually survived. So life is kind of unfair, right? Anyway, okay, so all these incidents that leads to the World War II is first 1931 Manchurian incident. We talk about this, and Japan withdrew from the League of Nations. Okay, and Japan got isolated from the world. And then Japan decided to follow its own path in Asia. Okay, Japan wanted to kick out all the white men in Asia. The 1937 February 26 incident pushed Japan further towards military rule. Okay, the parliament eventually stopped functioning. And then a couple of years later, after the 1936 incident, Japan had its first prime minister, military prime minister. That means prime minister from military. This is the first time in Japanese history. Yeah, Tojo Hideki. General Tojo is from military, but he was appointed as the prime minister. This is the first time in Japanese history. Okay, before Tojo, all the Japanese prime ministers are civil officials, but now a military man is controlling the government. Military man is controlling the government. Okay, all right. So 1937. This is a propaganda poster published in American newspaper. Uh, this picture is published after Pearl Harbor. Okay, so after Pearl Harbor, uh, the Americans, for the first time, a lot of Americans finally realized that there was one country, that is China, that has been resisting Japanese aggression for 4 years already. 4 years before Pearl Harbor, the Chinese have been fighting with the Japanese for 4 years already. Okay, and the origin for the war in China certainly is Japan's attempt to control the entire continent of China. Okay, and this is in conflict with American interests. Okay, when World War II broke out in Europe in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland, but in 1940 the Nazi army swept West Europe. We're talking about Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Okay, France surrendered in 6 weeks. Okay, France in 6 weeks after the war broke out, and Hitler almost invaded Britain. We all know Dunkirk, right? So Nazism is very successful in Europe. In 1940, if you look at America, FDR, President Roosevelt, at first did not want to participate in the war because America learned from the lesson, from World War One. Because we know that in World War One, Woodrow Wilson led Americans into the war, and the result is a death, is the deaths of more than 200,000 American young men. Okay, so domestically, a lot of Americans they don't wanna send their young men to another war overseas like they did in World War I, right? So between the wars, Americans decided that no, we're gonna have isolationism. Okay, we're gonna isolate ourselves from the outside world. No matter how different countries engage in war, we don't want to send our young men to war. So President Roosevelt, in during his campaign, he actually promised American people that he would not send more young men to Europe to die. Okay, and that's why he was elected, right? But when war is going on in both Europe and Asia, we're talking about the late 19th century and early for I'm sorry, we're talking about late 1930s and early 1940s, right? Uh, President Roosevelt is watching what's going on in the world very closely, very closely. So when in 1940, when the war in China has been going on for 3 years, and when the war uh, just broke out in Europe, Japan took the advantage and invaded Southeast Asia. Okay, so in addition to China, in 1940, Japan already occupied most of China, but they also invaded Southeast Asia. They took Vietnam, Cambodia, right? Those countries used to be um, governed by France. But when France surrendered to the Nazis in June 1940, Japan basically occupied all these French colonies in Southeast Asia. So this is they're furthering their occupation in Asia. So at that point, Roosevelt thought he had to intervene. Okay, the Americans sent a message to Japanese saying you have to withdraw from China. Okay, because your occupation in China violated our open door policy for China, and also you're occupying Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and other countries. So withdraw from the territories you occupied. Otherwise, there will be a oil embargo on you. So that means we're not gonna sell oil to you. But Japan needed the oil and other natural resources from overseas to continue the war. So this oil embargo based on China and Japan's occupation of Southeast Asia is the origin for the Pacific War. So there was a negotiation between Japan and America regarding these issues, but they never reached an agreement until the Japanese launched attack on Pearl Harbor. So now look at China. Look at China. 1937. Well, China was at that time was still split into different warlords. Okay, in the north there was some warlords in Shanghai. Chiang Kai-shek controlled Shanghai and Nanjing. But in other provinces are all ruled by different warlords. So China was weak. So Japan realized that they had to invade China as soon as possible because this weakness of China would not last long. Chiang Kai-shek in 1937 launched I mean, 10 years before 1937, and we're talking about 1927, Chiang Kai-shek launched a northern expedition from southern China, and he almost unified the entire China in 1927. And between 97 to 1937, during that decade, Chiang Kai-shek is trying to industrialize China, try to modernize China. And China's GDP is growing very fast, although not as fast as Japan, but still is making progress. And Chiang Kai-shek is expanding his own army to strengthen China's national defense. So Japan thought if they don't invade China now, it will be much harder 5 years or 10 years later. Okay, when China is stronger, it will be much harder for Japan to take it over. So in 1937, in a place called a Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing, once again, the local Japanese military officer they decided that they're gonna attack the Chinese. Okay, and this military operation again was not reapproved by their bosses in Tokyo. Tokyo have no idea what's going on in in local area. So the local Japanese military officer, they launched attack on the Chinese city, uh, and this time the Chinese they fought back. The Chinese fought back very bravely. So this picture was taken on that day, September 7th. This photo was taken in um, July 7th, 1937, on Marco Polo Bridge. On that bridge, the Chinese are fighting back against the Japanese, but they were defeated by the Japanese because the Japanese are better trained, better equipped, um, and better commanded. So World War II broke out in China in 1937. So that's the general consensus. Okay. All right. So when the all-out war broke out, Japanese easily took northern Chinese cities like Beijing and Tianjin, and then uh, in the south, the Japanese also sent a Shanghai expeditionary army to take Shanghai. So in August the 13th, the Battle of Shanghai broke out. Okay, the Japanese bombed Shanghai. This is almost the first time in human history when air force was used to bomb another city. Okay, bombing another city was not. I mean, bombing another city by air force was not a common strategy used in World War One, but now in World War Two, it was widely used, and the Japanese first started it. Okay, they bombed Shanghai, killing tens of thousands of innocent citizens in that city, the Battle of Shanghai. Chiang Kai-shek um, never surrendered to the Japanese. He sent his best army to Shanghai to defend that city. Okay, this is a photo of the Japanese Imperial Army on on the suburb of Shanghai. They're preparing to launch an attack of that city. Okay, and then this is the street fighting in Shanghai. As you can see, when the Japanese soldiers were shooting, on the background is a sign of Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola was already one of the most successful companies in China in 1937. Okay, in Shanghai, this American company is making a lot of money in Shanghai. So when Japanese came, of course, the colonial rule of Shanghai by Japanese certainly would affect American commercial interest in Shanghai. So you can see, so this picture pretty much shows why the war has to break out between America and Japan. This is all about the competition for the Chinese market. For the Chinese market. Okay, so keep in mind, this is the Chinese army. They were all wearing German-style helmets because Nazi Germany was the only country that is willing to sell weapons to Chinese. And then in 1937, a couple of weeks after the war broke out, the Japanese government sent a message to Hitler saying, you cannot sell any firearms or military equipment to Chinese anymore because we are fighting in China. And Hitler agreed. So after that, even Germany wouldn't sell any firearms to Chinese. China was not an industrialized country, so he couldn't produce most of the weapons they need in the war. So the Chinese had to buy firearms from industrialized countries like Germany or America. But in 1937, no other countries are willing to sell any weapon to Chinese. Okay, so this is a Shanghai train station when it was bombed. An American shot this documentary movie showing us the terrible situation of war. When the when the injured child is crying in the station, his family probably trying to get away from the city. Uh, when the train station was bombed, terrible experience. Um, and then Japanese occupied Shanghai city after 3 months of fighting, losing 100,000. Uh, Japanese suffered more than 100,000 casualties uh, in the Battle of Shanghai. It's a very bloody, brutal fighting in Shanghai. Finally, the Japanese took that city. They're shouting "Banzai" to their emperor. Okay, the next photo is gonna be a little graphic because when Japanese took Nanjing city, there was a larger scale massacre. A lot of head cutting, a lot of beheading, a lot of burying alive, right? A lot of raping that lasted for 6 weeks. This happened in December 1937 when the Japanese took the Chinese capital, Nanjing city. So this is a one Japanese newspaper published at the time when they occupied the China's capital, Nanjing City. This photo published on the newspaper is about a killing race. There's a killing race in Nanjing. It says, okay, if I have to let me translate this Japanese to you. It says, uh, killing race that involves more than 100 kills break the record. And one captain killed 106 in one day. The other captain killed 105 in one day. Uh, well, this is about a story of two captains, Japanese captains. They took Nanjing City, and in order to show the samurai honor, the samurai courage, and also to vent their anger on the Chinese who resisted very hard, they decided to have a killing race. So one morning they went out of their barrack. They were carrying their katana, the samurai sword, and they decided that they're gonna kill anyone, any Chinese on the street that they see. So by the end of the day, one killed 106 Chinese, the other killed 105. These are all innocent Chinese civilians on the street that they saw. So one of them won the race, and they laughed at it, and they drank sake to celebrate this killing race. And and uh, and the Japanese newspaper published a story to cover this. Okay, the Chinese did not know about this massacre. Chiang Kai-shek did not know about this massacre until much later. Okay, um, of course, in 1945, when Japan surrendered, there was this pursuit of all these war criminals. I mean, these guys are, of course, war criminals, right? They have to be punished by law. But it turned out that these two captains, after they committed all these atrocities in Nanjing City, later they were sent to Southeast Asia. Okay, in 1942, they were both of them were sent to Southeast Asia, and then both of them were sent to the Pacific Islands to fight against Americans. They did fight with Americans, and then in 1945, when war ended, both of them returned back to Japan. None of them got killed in action. They're just lucky, very very lucky. But when they returned back to Japan in 1945, um, the Chinese government wanted to arrest these two war criminals. Okay, they wanted to, but they couldn't find them. So the Chinese government sent a message to Tokyo, saying, I mean, there's a post-war government saying we want to arrest these two war criminals. Help us. So so eventually, the Japanese government they received a report from a local ramen restaurant boss. The local ramen restaurant owner reported to the government saying there's a one guy who came to my shop and he ordered a bowl of ramen and he ate it and he refused to pay. And when I asked him to pay, he said, "How dare you to ask me to pay?" He said, "I killed more than 100,000, 100 people in Nanjing City, and you dare to ask me to pay for this ramen?" So that's how he was arrested by the government. So eventually, these both of these two captains were arrested and sentenced to death. So justice fulfilled in that sense. But there's a lot of raping and killing of ordinary civilians and POWs in Nanjing. We don't know how many people got killed. Okay, probably the number of the people who got killed. I mean, POW, including POWs and innocent civilians, are between 200,000 to 300,000 in Nanjing City. So today there is a museum called the Nanjing Massacre Museum in Nanjing. It's actually a World War II museum. If you have a chance to go there, you could visit that museum. Okay, and in Nanjing there is one American missionary. If you look at this picture, her name is Minnie Vautrin. Minnie Vautrin is an American. She's from Illinois. She got a master's degree from Columbia University in education. In the 1930s, she was serving in Nanjing City in one of the Christian colleges. There is one college called Gingling Christian Women's College, and Minnie Vautrin was the president of that college. So when the Japanese occupied the city and was massacring the local Chinese people, Minnie Vautrin, she stepped out. She turned the Christian college's campus into a refugee uh, paradise. Basically, she accommodated tens of thousands of Chinese um, refugees coming to the campus. Actually, I actually went to the campus. I went to her campus. The campus is not very large. The campus is about the same size as UCCS campus. But can you imagine this campus actually accommodated tens of thousands of Chinese refugees? And she made agreements with the local Japanese occupation army saying this is an international safety zone, and the Japanese soldiers couldn't come into this our campus because it's an American a college campus, so we can accommodate Chinese refugees here. Um, if you kill Chinese outside of the campus, we cannot do anything about that. But you cannot do this on our campus. Okay, so that's what she did. That's what she did. Okay, but still, if you look at her diary, she actually left us a diary by Minnie Vautrin. Okay, Minnie Vautrin, that's her name. If you look at her diary, it's really full of sad stories. It is all about some Japanese soldiers coming to the campus, beat her up and trying to kidnap some Chinese girls for gang raping. She tried to stop all this but couldn't. So for that reason, she's full of a sense of guilt. Okay, because she wanted to help her Chinese students, but she couldn't. A lot of her Chinese students were killed or raped by Japanese. So a lot of atrocities. So in later, she returned back to Illinois, and even before the war ended, because she has seen so much atrocities of war, she suffered depression uh, until she killed herself in 1942 in Illinois. So she did not see the victory of the Allies, unfortunately. So this is a very kind of woman. If you go to the campus, the Christian college where she worked in Nanjing, you would see a bronze statue established on the campus to commemorate her. What's interesting is that the Chinese, just like the Japanese, their major religious belief is Buddhism. So the local Chinese, they knew that Minnie Vautrin saved a lot of Chinese lives. This American woman saved a lot of Chinese lives. So these local Chinese called her the living Buddha. They called her living Buddha. Despite that, she's actually a Christian missionary. So in this case, there is no boundary between religions as long as you save lives, if that makes sense, right? Okay, on the right, you see this German guy. His name is John Rabe. John Rabe, she worked with the Minnie Vautrin to set up this international military zone. They're like the Schindler. They're like the Schindler in Nanjing. They saved a lot of lives from the Japanese occupation army. And John Rabe, this German guy, he is actually a Nazi party member. But in 1937, when he saw all these atrocities, war atrocities, he wrote a letter to his leader, party leader, Hitler. He wrote a letter to Hitler. He says, um, Führer, our leader, please do something to stop Japanese atrocities. He believed that his conscience overcome his Nazi belief in this case. But of course, the letter never reached Hitler. It was stopped by the German secret police. Gestapo actually stopped his letter. They intercepted his letter before it reached Hitler. Okay, so the war is going on. The war is going on. 1937, here's a timeline. 1937, all-out war between China and Japan broke out. August 1937, the battle in Shanghai. And then in December, Nanjing, the capital city of China, was taken by Japanese. Um, and then Chiang Kai-shek, China's president, moved the capital first to Wuhan and then to Chongqing. And then they lost Wuhan city. The war basically came to a stalemate in 1938. Japan occupied almost half of China, including Manchuria, eastern China. All the coastal cities were taken, including Guangzhou. And then Chiang Kai-shek's government moved the capital into Chongqing here. Nanjing is here, okay? Shanghai is here, okay? Nanjing and Shanghai. And then Chongqing is here. But Chiang Kai-shek never surrendered, okay? Throughout World War II, during the 80 years of fighting, from 1937 to 1945, Chiang Kai-shek never surrendered. So that's a good thing. That's a good thing for the Allies, okay? Um, because if China has surrendered to Japan during World War II, then Japan could have used all the manpower and natural resources in China against America, right? Think about that. That would have been a disaster for America, right? Right. This could have happened. The surrender of China could have happened because France only resisted the Nazi invasion for 6 weeks, okay, and then it surrendered in 1940, okay, and then there was a puppet government in France called the Vichy French government. Vichy French government pretty much is the puppet of Hitler. They would do whatever Hitler wanted them to do. Okay, they would provide all these natural resources in France to support Nazis' expansion. Okay, so Japan could have used China as the backyard, right? The huge continent of Japan, as large as entire Europe. China is as large as entire Europe, a huge country. Japan could have used all these natural resources and manpower to strengthen itself against America. In that case, if that had happened, World War II would have lasted many more years, right? I mean, if you look at all these World War II movies about Pearl Harbor, about Iwo Jima, about Guadalcanal, about all these fierce fighting between America and Japan, you already know how how hard the Japanese soldiers could fight in those Pacific islands. But keep in mind that throughout the war, there was 1 million Japanese troops in Manchuria. There was another 1 million troops in China, in the rest of China. So China, by not surrendering, Chiang Kai-shek's China kept more than 2 million Japanese troops in the mainland. Okay, if if China had surrendered, Japan could have used the 2 million troops against America. Think about how many American young men would have died if that happened. So that's the contribution made by China to the war. Uh, so keep in mind. All right. So the war is going on in China. The war is going on in China. Let's look at the timetable. Starting from 1938, the war came to a stalemate. A stalemate. That means neither side could win the war. Okay, Chiang Kai-shek did not want to surrender, and Japan could not take over Chiang Kai-shek's government in Chongqing, although they bombed Chongqing every day. There were some military aids from Soviet Union at first, because Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union leader, is wanted China to keep on fighting Japan so that Japan would not invade the Soviet Union. So for that reason, Stalin supported some aids to China, but those aids stopped. In 1941 when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. In June 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union itself is in danger. So Stalin stopped all the military aids to China. So starting from 1941, China lost all aids from foreign countries. So finally, it was Americans that saved China. Okay. Um, well, long story short, let me just finish this timetable. In December 1941, when Pacific War broke out, this happened after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. When U.S. participated in the war, the Chinese considered this U.S. participation as a turning point of the Pacific War. Okay, and after that, there has been, according to Land Lease, this is a policy made by FDR.
There, according to Lend-Lease, there is military aids finally coming to China. Uh, but but since all the coastal cities of China, if you look at this map, all the coastal cities of China were taken by Japanese. The only American aids that could reach China had to be from India. Okay, so the Americans will have to send all the firearms, all the food, all the equipment to India, and then they would have U.S. Air Force. U.S. Air Force played a major role in this operation. They have to fly um, from India to Chongqing to China, and the American pilots had to fly over the highest mountain in the world, that is the Himalaya Mountains. We call this transportation line the hump. Okay, the hump. The hump airlines supplies made sure American aids are coming to China from India, so that China could keep on fighting, so that they would not surrender to Japan. And then on the other hand, the Americans are fighting against the Japanese over the sea. So over the sea. So that's the basic situation. Well, in China, Japanese pretty much occupied the major cities and the railroads, but China is too big. So this means Japanese cannot have an effective control of the countryside. A lot of villages, the vast countryside, Chinese peasants like these guys. Look at this picture. Uh, This shows the Chinese guerrilla. They are the local folks. They formed a lot of guerrilla to fight against the Japanese. They use very primitive weapons like a spear, spears, and knives to to fight against the Japanese Imperial Army. It did not work out that well, but they kept on fighting. So as a response, the Japanese had to launch a search and destroy strategy to to control the countryside, to control the countryside. What they do is that they're gonna send a small troops to the village, search for guerrilla fighters. Uh, if they find one, then everybody in the village will be killed, and the village will be burned. So this is called the three alls policy. The three alls policy means kill all, burn all, and take all. So it's a very, very brutal. One thing I need to mention is that during the whole war, the the Imperial Army is notorious in their logistics. That means they don't supply enough to their soldiers fighting in the front. This is a part of the Japanese military adventurism. That means they want a more war, they want a more fighting, but they don't want to provide more supplies to their soldiers. For example, food. The soldiers fighting in the front, they are asked to find the food by themselves. Okay, so this is why you see all these pictures. No, if when the Imperial Army invaded Southeast Asia, they took bananas from local area. When they were in China, they took the local cows, chickens. They just looting all the time. They're storming the local families, and they just take everything they wanted. Okay, terrible, terrible um, occupation policies. Occupation policies. Okay, and then, of course, during all the looting, there's a lot of killing happening. If they encounter any resistance, if anyone dare to say no, they would have killed that person. They would have killed that person. Um, it's a terrible, terrible experience. One thing I need to mention is the so-called comfort women system instituted by the Japanese government. In 1937, when the Imperial Army took Nanjing City, there was a large-scale raping. In addition to massacre, uh, there was we don't know how many rapes happened, but according to the Westerners' reports from the city, there was a large-scale raping. So Japanese government learned from this lesson. They don't want this large-scale raping happen again for the rest of the war. So they recruited young women in their home front to serve in the army. at first, the government would tell those young women that you're gonna be working as chefs, cooks, or nurses, okay, or other military assistants. The government would not tell what those young women are gonna do in the military. But when those young women were sent to the front, they would finally realize that they are gonna be working as sex slaves for the imperial soldiers. Yeah, these women are called comfort women. Okay, in those comfort women stations set up in the front, every most of the Japanese military units have one station like that. Those young women are going to be raped uh, dozens of times, or even more than 100 times each day. Terrible, terrible story. Okay, and then when the war is going on, the Imperial Army needs more comfort women, so they kidnapped Korean women, Taiwanese women, and Chinese women, and they forced them to serve as comfort women, basically sex slaves in the Japanese army. Um, this is a terrible, terrible um, thing that happened in the war. Actually, even in the Pacific Islands that the Americans fought with the Japanese, the Americans captured many comfort women. Some of them were already pregnant when they first captured by Americans. So at first, those Americans have no idea what these women are doing in the army, because it seems confusing. Eventually, they realize that this is they are the military prostitutes. They're actually not really prostitutes. They are sex slaves, because they are lied to by the Japanese government. Um, so this is a terrible, terrible chapter in the war. All right. So now let's talk about the politics. In 1940, Japan is totally isolated from the outside world, basically, but not the outside world. We're talking about the Western world, okay? And the only countries that are willing to ally with Japan were Nazi Germany and the fascist Italy. So in 1940, in order to ally together against the Soviet Union and the United States, the three countries we're talking about, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, they signed a tripartite pact, okay, in 1940. So these three countries, they call themselves Axis powers, right? Axial powers, right? Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. They formed this loose alliance. The purpose of this alliance uh, is to turn against the Soviet Union and America. Okay, so this happened in 1940. But although we call these three countries axial powers, but actually there is no substantial cooperation between these three countries. Okay, fascist Italy, their leader Mussolini, is a racist, so he had this deep contempt on all East Asian peoples, including Japanese. So Mussolini is actually he's not that active in this alliance. Okay, so you don't see any substantial military um, cooperation between Italy and Japan. And Hitler is not very certain about this alliance with Japan, because he is also a racist, right? Just like Mussolini. Um, so Hitler, as a racist, although he signed this tripartite pact with Japan, he had this strong doubt about Japan's ability to take over America. Okay, well, Japan never took over America, and it was defeated. So throughout the war, there was basically no orchestrated operation done by the three countries. What I'm saying is that think about Hitler's invasion to Soviet Union. This happened in June 1941, right? And then at the turning point of the German-Soviet War, okay, that was Stalingrad. Stalingrad is the winter. The Battle of Stalingrad happened in the winter of 1942, right? At that moment, Nazi Germany have put all their best troops into Stalingrad, and Stalin also mobilized his last divisions from Siberia to Stalingrad. So both sides have almost exhausted. At that moment, at that critical moment, if Japan had helped Nazi Germany in 1942 by sending maybe just 10 divisions to attack Soviet Union, Soviet Union would have collapsed. That's for sure. That's for sure in 1942. Okay, Soviets would not have won the battle at Stalingrad if Japan had attacked the Soviet Union from behind the back, right? Japan could have attacked Soviet Union from east, and Nazi Germany was attacking from west. So if Stalin had to fight on two fronts, he's doomed. He would have been doomed. But Japan did not do that. Now think about that. There was no coordination between these axial powers. Okay, and that's one of the, in my opinion, that's one of the major reasons why the axial powers lost the war. Of course, that's a good thing for the whole world, but we're just talking about history. What ifs. We're talking about what ifs in history, right? The only cooperation between Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany is probably about this Indian nationalist. Okay, there's one Indian nationalist. Is when Japan was attacking Burma. This is a part of the Pacific War. When Japan was attacking Burma, Japan sent a message to Indian nationalists. They say, "Hey, Indians, you're under this British colonial rule, right? In World War II, India was not an independent country. It was ruled by the British government. So Japan sent a message to Indian nationalists saying, if you help us, Japanese, okay, we will help you to kick out the white man, the British, or we will help you kick out the white man, the British." So some Indians actually believed this Japanese propaganda, okay, and then some Indian nationalists, they went all the way to Europe, okay, to Britain, and then they would flee to German occupied continent, and then there they would ask for help, uh, they would ask the Hitler's government for help, and Hitler did help to transport one of such Indian nationalists to using German submarine to transport him all the way to Far East and give him to Japanese. And Japanese would bring this guy to Burma, and this Indian nationalist would form a so-called Indian nationalist army to fight on the Japanese side. So situation is very very complicated in Southeast Asia. Japanese did use a lot of local nationalists and arm them to fight against the British and Americans. This is what happened. Okay. So yeah, I think we should end up our discussion right now because next time, next lecture we're gonna move on to the Pacific War. We're gonna talk about the details of the war between Japan and America. So we're gonna stop here.